Well, hi, I'm Elaine Shannon, a journalist, and I'm here with one of the most distinguished Middle East experts on the planet, Ambassador Dennis Ross, who's been through a lot of negotiations for several secretaries of state and two or three presidents. I lose count. He knows how much is at stake in the Israel Hamas negotiations and beyond. So we're just going to get right to it. What do you think, Ambassador Ross? What do we hope for, and what's going to happen next? That's going to
Look, I look at this as an agreement that emerged when it did because of what I call the Trump effect. This agreement, the outlines of this agreement, not just the outlines, the framework, the content, almost all the language was completed and accepted in July. So we're looking at months and months of not closing it. And there's a variety of reasons. I mean, Hamas would create an issue. Prime Minister Netanyahu presented some clarifications. I think Hamas seized on those clarifications. Point is, what produced the closure was the reality that President Trump was going to be inaugurated on January 20th. He made it clear he wanted this done before he was inaugurated. Now, his negotiator, the person he has designated to be his Middle East negotiator, is someone who was actually in Doha, went there, was part of the concluding part of the negotiations, flew from Doha to Jerusalem, saw Prime Minister Netanyahu on Saturday, and made it very clear to him that he needed to say yes to this. So we're seeing the Trump effect in terms of Prime Minister Netanyahu did not feel he could say no to Donald Trump. The Qataris and the Egyptians put a lot of pressure on Hamas to close because they also wanted to show President Trump that they could deliver and they could do something that he wanted. So they'd get on his right side. That kind of leverage doesn't necessarily exist for a long time, but it exists now. And it's very much in President Trump's interest to see this implemented. Again, understand his administration owns this agreement. We had an unusual relationship. In fact, I can't think of any that is the equivalent of it, with an outgoing administration and the incoming one completely agreeing and working together to get this done. Yes, this was all drafted by the Biden administration negotiators. But to close it, they needed the presence, not just the signal, not just the input. They needed the presence of Steve Witkoff, who is the President Trump's Middle East negotiator. Now, what was announced by the Qatari Prime Minister was that there are three parties who are responsible for monitoring this and three parties who are the guarantors of it. Now, the only real guarantor that matters in this case is the U.S. And the fact is, this is now a Trump administration agreement. It will be important, I think, for the Trump administration, for Steve Witkoff to put together a team of people who can be very active in terms of overseeing the implementation, because there are lots of potential problems with this implementation. You've got people returning in Gaza from the south to the north. They're not supposed to be carrying weapons. Is there a guarantee that they're not all going to be carrying weapons? Interesting question. There are Hamas fighters who are wounded who will be allowed to go to Egypt. Who is there an agreement on who they are? I mean, I can easily see problems cropping up, and this is where you'll need to have very clear understandings of what's been agreed, and very clear understandings from on the Israeli part, on the one hand, and I would say on the Hamas's part, at least as it relates to Qatar and Egypt will play a critical role here in terms of the implementation. A very clear understanding on everybody's part how we understand what each of these provisions means and what we expect in terms of it being carried out. So there's been a lot of work that's got into this, to say the least. There's a lot of work that's going to have to exist to help ensure that it gets implemented.
And then what about the ripple effect?
Well, there
Does
is an instant ripple effect. No, I'm glad you asked the question, because we know that one of the priorities that President Trump has is to expand the Abraham Accords. And that's a euphemism for saying Saudi-Israeli normalization. And the Saudis have made it very clear that, especially given the imagery that comes out of Gaza, which is an imagery that captures the death and destruction, the scope of which is literally hard to exaggerate. You know, by the way, in Israel, nobody sees it. In the Arab world, it's basically all they see. So for the Saudis, they want that war to be over, but that means they want Israel out of Gaza. So that will give President Trump and his administration an enormous incentive to make sure that all three phases of this agreement actually are carried out and implemented. It's only, we have a temporary ceasefire right now, and it goes on for 42 days, and 33 hostages will get released, and we will see close to 1,000 Palestinian prisoners released. Combination of those who have a lot of blood on their hands, a lot of people who were arrested since October 7th. And what we're going to see as this unfolds is on day 16 of the first phase, the negotiations for reaching understandings on phase 2 are to begin. They are to continue even if you finished the first phase and you haven't reached agreement. They are to continue into the second phase. But the aim of the second phase is to take what is a temporary ceasefire and turn it into a permanent ceasefire that then outlines the withdrawal of Israel from Gaza. So Prime Minister Netanyahu is going to say, and is saying, and he can legitimately say he has not agreed to end the war, because technically this agreement doesn't mean that there's a guarantee the war is going to end. But the fact is, you're supposed to, in phase 2, to reach an understanding that turns us into a permanent ceasefire. And if you don't achieve that in phase 2 and it falls apart and Israel resumes, I suspect that you'll see President Trump think, well, that's the agreement somehow hasn't been fulfilled. Now, if Hamas has violated it, he will be supportive of whatever the Israelis do. But if Hamas, and I would say that Hamas should have an interest in carrying this out, if they do, then it'll be pretty difficult to see this conflict resume, and you'll see the president's interest in doing a Saudi deal, I think, come to the fore in terms of helping to make sure a deal that the administration will own actually gets fulfilled.
That's fairly optimistic, and we see a lot of pessimism, especially coming out of some of the Israeli commentators who are critics of Netanyahu and his government.
Yeah.
You think that Netanyahu and his government can stick this landing for now?
Well, he's already experiencing some opposition. I think Minister Ben-Gvir will quit the government. I don't think Minister Smotrich will, but I also think that, Smotrich is saying if the second phase turns into a permanent status in the agreement, I'm sorry, a permanent ceasefire and the war is not resumed, then he will leave. The opposition has said, carrying out this agreement, there's an automatic safety net that they will give the government. They will not bring the government down, even if it loses its majority, and he could maintain a minority government. I think Prime Minister Netanyahu will go to great lengths to try to preserve his government. I think he'll try to persuade Smotrich to stay by saying, look, trading Gaza for you to be able to do what you want to get done on the West Bank, that's a good trade. And he may persuade Smotrich on that basis. But here you're going to see another tension. The other tension is, if you're going to do the Saudi normalization deal, the idea that there's any annexation of the West Bank, that will rule that out. A huge increase in building in the West Bank, I think that probably also makes it difficult for the Saudis to proceed. So there's we'll see an interesting test here of how important a priority it is for President Trump, to get this actually implemented as an agreement that in effect is his agreement, and B, how important is producing Saudi normalization with Israel to him as a priority. The more important it is, I continue to believe it's difficult. It will remain difficult for Prime Minister Netanyahu to say no to President Trump.
That's chilling, but true. Moving to Iran,
Yeah.
people are kind of discounting Iran these days. Do you think that it's possible or likely that Iran will do something bizarre and needy to get the spotlight back on whatever its policy, its position is, and
I
scare the hell out of people?
I think that Iran is not interested in any kind of conflict anytime soon. I think they're quite vulnerable right now, and they know it. Their domestic situation economically is quite bad. I mean, this is quite remarkable. You have a country that produces natural gas and oil, and it has electricity shortages. That speaks to the mismanagement, for sure, of the country. It is a country that has quite vulnerable because it's lost its strategic air and missile defense. It is probably lost 90% of its ballistic missile producing capability. So I don't think it needs to have a conflict right now. I don't think it has an interest in having a conflict right now. Does that mean it will do nothing? No. I think it will try to do everything it can first to sort of heat up the West Bank by continuing to try to smuggle weapons in there. I think it also will try to do a lot to try to destabilize Jordan. It's going to look, it has lost so much, what Qasem Soleimani called the ring of fire around Israel. Basically, that's collapsed. It's no longer there. The axis of what the Iranians call the axis of resistance, it has suffered a profound loss. So the regional balance of power has changed a lot. What could the Iranians do that might show they still have options? They can counteract some of what they've lost. Try to heat up the West Bank beyond where it is, but also try to destabilize Jordan. I think it's very important for the Trump administration and the Gulf states to be focused on Jordan and doing as much as they can to be helpful in Jordan right now. Jordan is a country that has the longest border with Israel. Jordan is a country that creates a buffer for the Gulf states. It is a long-time American partner and friend, and I think this is certainly an area that we should be paying attention to in terms of where it is that Iran can engage in indirection, and yet possibly from its standpoint begin to show that it's not down and out.
Are there ripple effects that extend beyond to Russia, Ukraine?
Look, I've been uneasy that one of the things that Putin might want to do with President Trump is to say, look, I can help you on Iran if you will help me on Ukraine. And look, the Russians have just concluded, you had the president of Iran meeting Putin today in Moscow, and they are concluding a strategic cooperation agreement. We should have profound concern less about that, because this is more, I think, a sign of the weakness of both, that they need each other and don't have lots of options. But I'm concerned about where the Iranian nuclear program is, and this is a country that probably has accumulated 11 bombs worth of highly enriched uranium. I'm worried about that some of that is being diverted, and we won't know where it is necessarily. So, if we're going to deal with the Iranian nuclear program, 2025 is going to be a pivotal year for doing that. It's possible that Putin will come in and say, look, here's what we can do to deal with your concern on that if you help me address some of my concerns. And we know that President Trump appears to want to have an early meeting with President Putin. I think Putin will come in. Think about Putin has laid out a series of conditions on Ukraine, which they add up to a complete capitulation on the part of Ukraine. I can envision him meeting with President Trump, where he comes in and he says, look, because of you, I'm prepared to make a number of moves away from what I've said I needed. So this is a way to convince President Trump that he's already producing from Putin. And what it reflects is, you establish certain conditions that seem extreme, and then you're prepared to give some of them up. And it looks like you're being reasonable. I anticipate that. I anticipate maybe also a recognition of our concerns about Iran and how they might try to help address some of them.
Well, that's a lot to think about this weekend. Is there anything else that we should be thinking about that will ruin our weekend and early next week?
Well, I want to end up with a more positive sense of possibilities. Look, the one thing that is very clear, the Israeli military achievements have transformed the balance of power in the region. That's the good news. Now, these become something other than tactical if you can turn them into strategic gains. And I think there's a potential for that, but it will require greater attention to the Middle East than is probably the instinct of many of those coming in the Trump administration. Many will want to shift the focus to the Indo-Pacific and China. And I'm not saying that isn't important. We have to be able to compete with China for sure. But I also know one thing about the Middle East, and I've said this to presidents and secretaries of states that I've worked with. You may think you can disengage from the Middle East. You may think you can walk away from the Middle East, but the Middle East will not walk away from you. And sooner or later, it'll bring you back. It's like the line from I think Godfather 3. Every time I think that I try to walk away and get away, they just draw me right back in. And you don't want to be drawn back in worse circumstances. The good news is you have a changed balance of power. And that's why I think the key is making sure that during this year, Israel is out of Gaza, because that really will help you move on the normalization track with Saudi Arabia, and focusing on what your strategy towards Iran has to be to deal with the nature, not just of it's weaker in terms of its proxies, but it poses a real threat, I think, in terms of where the nuclear program is. And there really has to be a serious effort. Here, I think the instinct of President Trump is to do a deal. He will do maximum pressure, which is maximum economic pressure. But I think he can take advantage of what is a very real likelihood of an Israeli threat to act against the nuclear program. Use the threat of military force, the Israelis and maybe our own, if there isn't a deal. I think the potential under those circumstances, by the end of 2025, we could have a very different Middle East and one that's much more promising.
It's an opportunity.
It is.
And
it is an opportunity. Let's put it this way. It won't happen on its own.
No. And we have a lot of interest in making it happen. Well, Ambassador Ross, thank you so much for taking a busy Friday and a few minutes to speak with us at Cipher Brief. I really appreciate it.
Glad to do it. Thanks. Thanks for having me.